At my scheming niece's anniversary party, they handed me a name tag that read, "The Forgotten Aunt." I pinned it to my dress, smiled through the sting, and as the rented shuttle bus carried me away from the glittering Grand Meridian Hotel, the family received the bill for the entire celebration. I'm Clara Thornton, and this is my story. Stay with me until the end, and please, drop a comment with the city you're listening from. I'd love to know how far my words have traveled. The night began with such hope. I'd spent hours getting ready, my arthritic fingers fumbling with the buttons of the lavender dress I'd sewn myself. Each stitch a labor of love from my days as a seamstress. At 68, I still took pride in my work, even if the world had moved on to fast fashion. The invitation to Natalie's 10th anniversary party had arrived weeks ago, formal and cold, but it felt like a chance to mend the fraying threads of our family. I'd barely seen them in years, my sister Margaret, her husband, Natalie, or her slick businessman husband, Victor. I'd raised Natalie through tough times, sewn her prom dress, paid for her dreams. Surely, this night would bring us closer. But when I stepped into the chandelier-lit ballroom, the air thick with jazz and laughter, the event coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, handed me that name tag, "The Forgotten Aunt," scrawled in careless ink. My heart sank, but I pinned it on, hoping it was a mistake. It wasn't. That night I learned just how little I meant to the family I'd given everything for. I've always believed a well-stitched seam can hold anything together. Fabric, memories, even a family. At 68, my hands, knotted with arthritis, still remember the rhythm of threading a needle from my days running a small sewing shop on the outskirts of Chicago. I crafted wedding gowns that made brides weep, prom dresses that sparkled in young girls' dreams. I kept a spool of thread in my pocket, a habit from fixing hems on the fly, and wore my silver hair loose, a quiet rebellion against the tight buns of my youth. My life was simple, my apartment small, but I was proud of what I'd built, stitch by stitch. That night at Natalie's 10th anniversary party, I wore a lavender dress I'd sewn myself, each button a labor of love. Natalie wasn't just my niece. She was the closest thing I had to a daughter. When my sister Margaret's first marriage fell apart, I took Natalie in, taught her to embroider flowers on pillowcases, to dream beyond her parents' fights. When Ipwipe, Margaret remarried a wealthy businessman, everything changed. Natalie's visits faded, her calls stopped, but I told myself they were just busy. Families drift, don't they? The invitation to the Grand Meridian, formal and cold, felt like a chance to mend those fraying threads. I'd saved for weeks to buy a gift, a silver locket engraved with Natalie's initials, hoping it would remind her of the aunt who'd never stopped caring. My shop had been my sanctuary after my husband passed 20 years ago. I poured my grief into every gown, every hem, until the bills piled too high. When Margaret asked for help with Natalie's college tuition, I didn't hesitate. I sold my shop, my haven of thread and thimbles, for $120,000, every penny for Natalie's future. Margaret promised it was an investment, that they'd look after me. I moved into a cramped apartment, the walls so thin I could hear my neighbor's TV, convincing myself it was worth it. But the Sunday dinners they promised never came. Christmas. Visits were rushed. The gifts I'd spent hours sewing, scarves, quilts, left unopened as they hurried out the door. As I stepped into the ballroom, the jazz notes swirling like silk, I felt a flicker of hope. The tables were draped in linens I could have sewn better, the guests in dresses that echoed my old designs. Natalie, radiant in a gown I hadn't made, stood with Victor, her husband, whose sharp smile I'd never trusted. Margaret and her husband, mingled with the elite, their laughter bright but distant. I clutched the locket in my purse, picturing Natalie's face when she opened it. I'd been there for her first stitches, her first heartbreaks, her first dreams, Surely tonight they'd see me, not just as an aunt, but as family. That name tag, the forgotten aunt, was the first tear in that fragile hope. A rip, no. Needle could mend. The ballroom was a whirl of elegance, crystal glasses clinking, dresses rustling, laughter rising like bubbles in champagne. But as I stood there, the name tag pinned to my lavender dress, the forgotten aunt, felt heavier than any fabric I'd ever held. My fingers, used to threading needles through stubborn silk, trembled as I touched the tag. Surely, this was a mistake, a cruel oversight. I approached the event coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard and a smile as stiff as starched linen. "Excuse me," I said, my voice thinner than I intended. "There's a problem with my name tag." She barely glanced up. "We're very busy, ma'am. The toasts start in 10 minutes. Please take your seat." I opened my mouth to protest, but she was already waving the next guest forward. I stood, frozen, the tag burning against my chest. Across the room, Natalie glowed in her gown, surrounded by friends, her laughter bright and careless. Victor, her husband, stood beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, never landing on me. My sister Margaret, elegant in a dress I could have sewn circles around, leaned into her husband's arm, both of them basking in the glow of their wealth. I hadn't seen them in months, yet here they were, so close, so unreachable. I pinned the tag more securely, telling myself no one would notice. No one had noticed me in years, had they? An usher, a young man who wouldn't meet my eyes, led me to my seat, table 22, tucked in the far corner, half hidden behind a gaudy floral screen that blocked my view of the head table. I settled in, smoothing my dress, clutching the small purse that held Natalie's locket. The gift had cost me weeks of careful budgeting, but I'd imagined her opening it, her eyes softening as she remembered our old days together. Around me, the table filled with strangers, distant cousins, business associates, people who glanced at my name tag and quickly looked away. "Is this seat taken?" An older woman, her hair a soft white cloud, pointed to the chair beside me. I shook my head, grateful for any company. "Eleanor Hayes," she said, offering a warm smile. "I catered Margaret's first wedding. Haven't seen her in years." I managed to smile, the one I'd perfected at family gatherings, where I was more guest than kin. "I'm Natalie's aunt," I said, my voice catching. "Her mother's sister." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "The aunt, sitting back here, behind this screen." I shrugged, the familiar ache settling in. "It's fine," I lied, though it wasn't. As the toast began, I strained to see past the flowers. Natalie and Victor stood arm in arm, their vows renewed with polished charm. When Margaret spoke, her voice dripping with pride, she recounted Natalie's childhood, her first dance recital, her college graduation. I waited for my name, for some mention of the summers I'd spent raising her, the nights I'd stayed up sewing her dresses, the money I'd given for her dreams. But my name never came. The guests applauded, and I clapped too, my hands shaking, a tear slipping down my cheek. Not of joy, but of something sharper, something closer to grief. The dinner passed in a blur. Table 22 was a mix of misfits, people who, like me, didn't quite belong. I pushed my food around, my appetite gone, and decided to deliver my gift. I made my way to the head table, the locket clutched in my hand. Natalie saw me coming and whispered something to Victor. They turned, their smiles tight. "Natalie, darling," I said, my voice unsteady. "You look beautiful." She nodded, her eyes flickering to the crowd. "Oh, Aunt Clara, you made it!" "Of course," I said, holding out the locket. "A small gift for your special day." She glanced at it, barely touching the box. "Thanks. You can leave it with the others." She gestured to a table piled with lavish gifts, then turned to Victor, already laughing at something he said. I stood there, dismissed, my heart sinking. As I placed the locket among the glittering packages, I noticed a clipboard left on a nearby chair, its pages fluttering. Curiosity or maybe desperation drew me to it. Under special arrangements, I saw my name. Clara Thornton, far seating, minimal contact, per Margaret's request. The room spun. I gripped the chair, my breath shallow. All these years, I'd made excuses for them. The missed calls, the rushed visits, the birthdays they forgot. I told myself they were busy, that family life was complicated. But this wasn't neglect. This was deliberate, a plan, written in black and white, to keep me invisible. I remembered the summer Natalie was 8, when I taught her to embroider a rose on a handkerchief, her small hands fumbling with the needle. "You're my favorite aunt," she'd said, her smile brighter than any thread. I'd sold my shop, for her, given up my haven of scissors and satin, believing it was for her future. But now, standing in that ballroom, I saw the truth. They'd taken my money, my love, my time, and decided I was nothing. I found a quiet corner near the coat. Check, my hands shaking as memories flooded back. The day I closed my shop, the sign coming down, the sewing machine sold off. There were $120,000 I'd handed to Margaret, her promises of gratitude, of family. The apartment I'd moved into, its thin walls and leaking pipes, where I'd sit alone, on Sundays, waiting for visits that never came. I'd sewn Natalie's prom dress, stayed up late to finish it, but she'd stopped wearing my creations when Margaret's new husband brought wealth into their lives. My modest ways, my quiet life, weren't enough for them anymore. The weight of it all pressed down, a seam splitting under too much strain. Something inside me, something I'd patched and mended for years, finally tore. I wasn't just forgotten, I was erased. And in that moment I knew I couldn't let it continue. Not anymore. The ballroom's glow felt like a distant dream as I stood in that quiet corner. The clipboard's words, Clara Thornton, far seating, minimal contact, per Margaret's request, burning in my mind. My hands, once steady, enough to sew delicate lace, shook as I clutched my purse. For years I'd patched over their neglect, telling myself it was my fault, that I wasn't enough. But this wasn't a loose thread I could mend. This was a deliberate cut, and it severed something deep inside me. I wasn't just forgotten, I was unwanted, and for the first time in my 68 years, I felt a spark of anger, sharp, unyielding, like a needle piercing through. I made my way to the coat check, my steps slow but purposeful. The party carried on behind me, laughter and music spilling out, but I was done being a shadow. As I waited for my coat, a familiar voice called out, "Clara? Clara Thornton?" I turned to see a man in a driver's uniform, his face weathered but kind. "It's Tom Bradley," he said, grinning. "You sewed my daughter's wedding dress, 15 years back. Best dress I ever saw." His warmth was a lifeline, pulling me from the fog of hurt. I managed to smile. "Tom, it's been a while." He glanced at my name tag, his brow furrowing. "The forgotten aunt? What's this nonsense?" I shrugged, the weight of it too heavy to explain. "It's been this way for years," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I just didn't want to see it." Tom's eyes softened. "That's not right, Clara. You deserve better." He checked his watch. "I'm driving the shuttle for the guest tonight. No pickups for a bit. Can I give you a lift home? No charge." I hesitated. Glancing back at the ballroom where Natalie and Victor were posing for photos, Margaret's laughter ringing out. They wouldn't notice I was gone. They hadn't noticed me all night. "Yes," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I'd like that." As we walked to the shuttle, I overheard the event coordinator arguing with the hotel manager in the lobby. "Final payment's due tonight," the manager said, flipping through papers. "The family's card is on file. Balance of $38,000. I paused, my heart quickening. An idea, small at first, began to stitch itself together. In the shuttle, settled into the worn leather seat, I turned to Tom. "Do you know who's paying for this party?" I asked carefully. He nodded. "Margaret arranged it through our service. She and Natalie signed the contracts, but I heard Margaret mention your name, said you were helping with costs." My breath caught. I'd never agreed to pay for anything. Months ago, Margaret had called, asking for a small contribution to make the party special. I'd offered $25,000 from my savings, thinking it was for Natalie, believing it would show I still mattered. But they'd lied. They'd taken my money and labeled me forgotten. Tom's voice broke through my thoughts. "Clara, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I said, a real smile tugging at my lips for the first time that night. "Just clarity." I leaned forward. "Tom, how well do you know the hotel's management?" He met my eyes in the rear-view mirror, a knowing glint in his gaze. "Pretty well. Been driving their guests for years. Why?" I took a deep breath. "I need to make a change to the payment arrangements tonight." Tom chuckled softly. "You're up to something, aren't you? I like it." At the hotel's billing office, the night manager was skeptical until I showed my ID and explained I'd been listed as a contributor. "I want to withdraw my $25,000, I said, my voice firm. "It was a misunderstanding." The manager hesitated. "Family disagreement?" he asked. "Family clarification," I corrected. He nodded, making a few calls. Within minutes, my contribution was removed. The full $38,000 balance shifted back to Margaret and Natalie. As I left, Tom waiting outside, I felt lighter, like I'd cut away a heavy, fraying seam. The next morning, my phone rang relentlessly. I let it go to voicemail, sipping tea in my small apartment as Margaret's voice filled the room sharp with rage. "Clara, what have you done? The hotel's charging us everything. Call me back now." Natalie called next, her tone tearful but calculated. "Aunt Clara, we had to cancel our anniversary trip because of this. How could you?" I listened, my heart steady. I thought of the name tag, the floral screen, the clipboard's cold instructions. I thought of the $120,000 I'd given for Natalie's education, only to live in a crumbling apartment while they flaunted their wealth. Then came a call from my bank. "Miss Thornton, this is Walter from First Community Bank. There's been an attempt to access your savings account with a power of attorney document. It didn't look right, so we blocked it. Can you come in?" My blood ran cold. I'd never signed any such document. At the bank, Walter showed me the paper, a forged signature, close but not mine, in Margaret's unmistakable flourish. "This is fraud," I said, my voice shaking, not with fear, but with resolve. Walter nodded gravely. "We'll secure your accounts, but you should speak to a lawyer." That afternoon, I met with Patricia, an attorney specializing in elder law. She listened as I poured out the story, the party, the name tag, the money, the forgery. Her eyes narrowed. "This is elder abuse, Clara. We can protect you." I left her office with a plan to lock down my finances and a growing sense of power. I wasn't just fighting back. I was reclaiming myself. But I couldn't stay in Chicago, surrounded by memories of betrayal. I called my oldest friend, Helen, who'd moved to a small town in Oregon years ago. "Helen," I said, my voice catching, "is your guest room still open?" She laughed, warm and bright. "Clara, I've been waiting for you to ask. Come tomorrow." I packed a suitcase, my sewing kit tucked inside, and booked a train ticket. As I boarded, I silenced my phone, ignoring the voicemails piling up from Margaret, Natalie, even Victor. They'd feel my absence now, just as I'd felt theirs for years. In Oregon, Helen's cottage was a haven of cedar and sunlight, nestled near a forest that whispered peace. I unpacked my sewing machine, set it up in her spare room, and felt a spark of joy I hadn't known in years. The local community center needed someone to teach sewing classes, simple projects for kids and seniors. I hesitated, my confidence frayed, but Helen pushed. "You've got magic in those hands, Clara. Share it." So I did. I taught children to sew buttons, elders to mend old quilts, and with every stitch, I felt myself mending too. For the first time, I wasn't sewing for someone else's dreams. I was sewing for mine. Oregon's mornings were a gift I hadn't known I needed. I'd wake to the sound of a stream gurgling outside Helen's cottage, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. At 68, I'd found a rhythm, sipping tea by the window, threading my old sewing machine, teaching classes at the community center. The kids would giggle as they stitched clumsy buttons, and the seniors would share stories of their own mending days, their hands trembling but eager. Each class felt like stitching a new piece of myself back together, a quilt of purpose I hadn't realized I'd lost. My Chicago life felt like a distant memory, but the wounds lingered. I'd silenced my phone after leaving, but the voicemails kept coming. Margaret's sharp demands, Natalie's tearful pleas, Victor's clipped threats. I listened to them like they were echoes from someone else's story. "Clara, this is ruining us," Margaret snapped in one. "The hotel bill's a nightmare. Fix this." Natalie's voice was softer, practiced. "Aunt Clara, we're struggling. Is this what you wanted?" I'd think of that name tag, the forgotten aunt, and the clipboard's cold instructions. I'd think of the $120,000 I'd given, the shop I'd sold, the years I'd waited for them to care. Then I'd turn off the phone and go back to my sewing. 3 months in, as autumn painted Oregon's trees in gold and crimson, Helen handed me the local paper, her face troubled. "You need to see this," she said. In the real estate section was an ad. "Charming Chicago cottage for sale. Perfect for artists or retirees. Historic home, once a seamstress's haven with original charm." My heart stopped. It was my old house, the one where I'd run my shop, where I'd raised Natalie during her parents' divorce, where I'd sewn her first dress. I'd inherited it from our parents, kept it maintained despite rarely visiting. It was in my name, alone. I'd never authorized the sale. The contact, Margaret's real estate firm. My hands shook as I called the bank. Walter wasn't in, but his assistant confirmed my fear. A deed transfer had been filed weeks ago with a forged signature. I contacted Patricia, my lawyer, who didn't hesitate. "This is fraud, Clara. We'll stop it." She sent a cease and desist letter demanding the deed be restored or face criminal charges. Within days, the listing vanished. A week later, the deed was back in my name. Patricia called, her voice triumphant. They folded fast. They knew they couldn't win. I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt hollow. The house was mine again, but the family I'd loved was gone forever. Not because I'd left, but because they'd never truly been mine. I sat by Helen's fireplace that night, a glass of wine warming my hands, and made a decision. I called Patricia. "I want to update my will," I said. "The house, my savings, everything goes to the community center here in Oregon. For sewing classes, for women like me who need a fresh start." She paused. "You're sure?" I was. The center had given me purpose, a place where I wasn't forgotten. It deserved my legacy, not a family who'd only valued my money. The next day, I called Natalie one last time. "Aunt Clara," she answered, her voice wary. "Are you coming back?" I took a breath, steady. "No, Natalie, I'm calling to say goodbye." A sharp gasp came through the line. "Goodbye? Because of the house? We're sorry, it was a mistake." I closed my eyes, picturing her at 8, her small hands fumbling with a needle as we embroidered together. "It wasn't a mistake," I said softly. "It was a choice. Just like the name tag, the seating, the money you took. I've given you everything, my shop, my home, my love. And you forgot me long ago, Natalie. I'm just choosing to remember myself now." Silence stretched, heavy with all we'd never say. "So that's it?" she whispered. "You're erasing us." I shook my head, though she couldn't see. "No, you erased me. I'm just acknowledging what's true." I hung up, my heart heavy but free. I walked to the stream behind Helen's cottage, the water glinting under a fading sky. In my hand was a handkerchief I'd embroidered, a rose like the one I'd taught Natalie to make. I let it fall into the current, watching it drift away, a final letting go. At 68, I learned that family isn't the people you sacrifice for. It's the ones who see you, who cherish you. I'd spent years sewing for others, mending their tears, but I'd forgotten to mend my own. In Oregon, I found a new family, not of blood, but of shared stitches, shared stories. It's never too late to cut the threads that bind you to pain. It's never too late to sow a new life, one where you're not forgotten but cherished, starting with yourself.